Let's talk about this. Three benchmarks for better knowledge. Findable, followable, scannable. And I've got to bring up my slides on the other screen so I can keep us going along here. Well, to start off with, I'm going to start with a bit of an analogy. So I used to work as a music copyist in LA, and most people don't know what a music copyist is. That's not Napster where you're just copying MP3 files. That was not what I did. What I did is I would prepare sheet music. Now, there's two different types. There's a music engraver and music copyist. And when you're a music engraver, you're preparing music for a book. So it's going to be printed in a book, in a sheet music book. But when you're a music copyist, you're preparing for a performance. And that is very different. So I worked in the film music industry. I was preparing scores, not scores, actually, individual parts for musicians that are going to be in recording sessions for film music. And when you're preparing music for a performance, it's not just about making sure that the notes are on the page. You are designing this with that performance in mind because when you've got a studio full of 100 or so musicians, if somebody makes a mistake, that costs a lot of money when we got to go back and redo a take. And so you're designing the sheet music so that they can get it right the first time. You want to put the page turns in the right place. You're making sure you're not hiding beats in there and you're notating in a way that it's optimized for someone to perform. Well, why am I talking about this? Well, we want to do the same thing. Too much of documentation is written with the idea that it's going to be in a book and not from the lens of this is going to be used for a performance. Well, what's that performance? That performance is when somebody has to use it to do their job. Now, we're going to talk about a very specific type of documentation today on this call. So I want to help clarify what we're talking about here. So if we were to look at, let's take, for example, a financial organization. We're going to talk about three levels of knowledge that that organization has to deal with. There's regulatory. This is the same for everybody in their industry. It's available online, and it's going to have all these rules that they need to follow. Somebody's going to take those rules and they're going to create general policy and process for it. And this will usually be somewhere on a shared point drive somewhere with Word files that you're going to have your policies and your procedures. But these are too high level for someone to actually use to do something. So somebody reads these policies and procedures and translates them into what we call operational knowledge. This is where I open this software application, I click here, I do this, I make this decision, I follow these steps. There's somebody who's translated that. And the problem is most of this is stuck in people's heads. Or if it is documented, it's not in a way that is findable and followable. We're going to talk about how do we do that. And we're talking specifically about operational knowledge. How do I have something? This is the performance. I have to do something. When you get this right, it's really amazing. We had one client we worked with this week said, it doesn't feel anymore like we have new employees. Like they can do things on their own. They can work independently. And so this is a really important skill to have as you're preparing guides. Okay, so the standard that we always adhere to when we're looking at measuring the effectiveness of a guide is it findable, followable, scannable? So findable means can somebody find it in 5 seconds or less? Followable means they can follow it with nobody helping them. And scannable means they're not going to encounter a 20-page PDF or word soup that's going to make them have to stop, tell whoever they're working with to wait while they read this thing to figure out what to do. For it to really be effective, it has to hit all of these criteria: findable, followable, scannable. Let's start with findable. Let's jump in. Okay, if we're going to make it findable, we need to understand this. It's funny when we talk to people about search, what they really want is something that can read somebody's mind. Well, not even Google can do that. Okay, Google's invested billions, right, in their search engine. But what do they spend all this time teaching people how to do and whole industry is built around it? It's search engine optimization. Google doesn't automatically find things. People design things so that they'll get found on Google. You need to use the same mindset. So we need to understand, if you're really good at SEO, you're figuring out what people are searching for, and then you're mapping content to that. When we think of operational knowledge is always used in response to an input. That could be a request, it could be a question, it could be a task you have to perform. You have some sort of input, You then have a process you follow that involves tools and steps, and hopefully you get the right output. If you understand the input, you apply the right process, you'll get the right output. So let's look at some financial institution examples like I lost my card, or I'd like to dispute a charge, or I'm traveling internationally next month. I want to increase my spending limit. All of these are inputs that an employee might need to respond to. Then they're going to need to find it. So ideally, the input happens, they know what needs to be done, and they know how to do it. Well, if we're going to make it, usually what happens though is they can't. They can't find, they don't, either don't understand what the input is talking about. They don't know what the question is, or then they can't find the resource that they need. So then they turn and ask for some help for someone, either to understand what the input is or to find the steps or get directed on the steps that they need to follow. So how do we make this findable? We need to match our article titles to the inputs they're receiving. The first step when we work with clients, the biggest mistake we see is you'll have these big procedures that have multiple inputs in them. So they have articles for multiple inputs. It's like digital banking. And now this is everything I could possibly need to know about digital banking. But nobody's calling in and saying, tell me everything that I could possibly ever want to know about digital banking. They're saying, why am I not seeing this deposit on my, online? Or I saw this transfer, where did that come from? They're asking specific questions. And so what we need to do is pull out from these massive documents the procedures that are in there. So looking at this, here's an example of what we might do. We've got this whole thing on direct deposit. We're going to pull out a specific input, setting up direct deposit with employer or another entity. This is an input we receive. Somebody's asking this. And so if you think about this, what is the question? What's the input that we're receiving? Those become the titles of your articles. And when you do that, search starts working really, really well. And there's lots of things you can do to improve search, but this is the biggest by far. Why? Because they're going to find what they need if they are trained to enter the input. But also, when it comes up in their search results, they're going to recognize that this is the article they need. The other thing is it prevents them from having to do what we call the double find. So most people are used to this. They're searching for something like, how do I set this up with an employer? And they find the direct deposit or the digital banking thing, and then they have to hit Control F on the Word or PDF file to find where in that procedure they need to go. So the first thing in making things findable, match it to the inputs and break apart those large documents so that you're matching that each article matches to an input. So little checklist here for you. Make sure your guides are covering one topic or procedure. Don't overload your guides. That's really, we like to do that from an authoring standpoint because it's all very neat and organized. It doesn't empower performance. So break those things up and make sure the titles match the inputs. We'll say things like you've got a title that's called like accounts, or sometimes the documentation, it's got all these crazy numbers, which is really great for organizing all your stuff, means nothing to the people who have to use it. Make sure the titles match the inputs that they're receiving. Okay, now let's go on to Followable. And it's funny, a lot of times when we talk to organizations, they think they'll tell us our biggest problem is people can't find the documentation. The documentation's good, it's just they can't find it. And 90% of the time, that documentation is not followable. We'll ask them to run a test. Say, put the document in front of someone that's there, pretend that they found it somehow, and have them follow it without anybody else helping them. And it doesn't work. So what do you do to make something more followable? Well, a lot of times you'll see things like this. You'll see these paragraphs of text that are mixing in all these instructions in one paragraph. You need to make sure that the guide follows this procedure through from the beginning to the end, and that it includes all the steps that need to be followed. So when you do this, sometimes we'll see in documentation, there's either steps that are skipped or that are too ambiguous for someone to really know what to do. If there's somebody who's really expert, then they might be able to follow it. But if they're less experienced, it's not very clear for them. So what we want to do is translate it into something that's it's like a recipe that's going to walk you through step by step from the beginning of that process all the way to the end of it. The next thing is decision trees are really important because a lot of times we'll see documentation where it says, if you're in this situation, jump down to step 25. If not, then go down to step 32. And then you get down to step 35 and it says, well, if it's this situation, you should go back to step 15. It's like this crazy choose your own adventure book, if you remember those, where you're flying all over the place. That's impossible for someone to follow. So if there's a lot of if then in your procedures, decision trees make a huge difference in somebody's ability to follow because they're not having to translate all this information in their mind. They can just respond to questions to move through. So here are a couple of tips for making things followable. First, a clear path from the first to the final step. And for those of you who have used ScreenSteps, we have a great tool for this, Clarify AI, where you can paste in your procedure or you can talk through your procedure, and the AI will give you a very clear path of what you're supposed to follow there. No jumping back and forth. So you should never be saying jump back to step 2 or jump back to step 5. Remember, you are preparing for performance. So even if you have to repeat some things, which ideally you won't, usually you don't have to if you structure these things correctly, but don't make them jump all around. That is not going to empower someone to perform very well using that. And then finally, use decision trees for those complex workflows. They will really make it a lot easier for someone to do. And I would add one more here that I didn't include, but I just thought of is interactive checklists are great for making something followable. When we write guides, we typically write them for first-time users, but we want people using them all the time because we know they can't remember everything, so they need that. What an interactive checklist allows you to do is you can have a high-level checklist for the key steps of the process, and that works for more experienced users who are not overwhelmed with information. But less experienced users are able to expand out more detail in there, and that means that they have enough information to complete the task. They can follow it on their own, but the more experienced employee can also follow it and not be overwhelmed with too much information in there. Okay, now let's move on to Scannable. So Scannable, we're using images with annotations makes things much more scannable. So like I said, I'm not a big fan of capturing the whole screen. That's too big. It's hard for them to orient. If you go too small, then it's hard. You're playing hide and seek on the screen trying to figure that out. If you go for the corners of an interface or some kind of big landmarks of it, there's enough there for them to have context, but it's not so big that they're lost in that. The idea is just so they can look at those screenshots and they know they're in the right place. This is super helpful. Like, especially some people say, well, oh, what if they get out of date? Well, if the screenshots get out of date, that is actually going to communicate to someone when they're following it, like, hey, wait a second, this is maybe something's changed here. If all you have is text, they don't know that. And I run into online documentation all the time where it's just text-based and their UI has changed, and now the instructions don't match what's happening in the UI. So this is really important. Images with annotations make a huge difference in making something scannable. Next are text callouts. Now you have to be careful here. Sometimes you have these styles in ScreenSteps where you can call out certain text blocks. We've seen people overuse these and it looks like a rainbow. So we don't want rainbow documentation where there's like every color of the rainbow on there. Realize if you use it too much, then it doesn't mean anything. But if there's key points or if there's parts where you're watching someone follow these, where they tend to skip a step or important part, use these text callouts. This combined with headings helps the eye kind of navigate how I'm going to move through this document and where I need to slow down a little bit to maybe pay attention to some detail. And then finally, once again, use lists and decision trees. So when you're writing, use very actionable language. You don't need full sentences. You just need to communicate. And bulleted lists, numbered lists are very helpful in this, just to go through. I almost never use anything that is in a paragraph because unless it's something they need to read, I really want to move that into a bulleted list. And then the decision trees make all the difference here when you're having to navigate a situation and you can go through with the decision tree. It makes it so much easier for this to be scannable because I know right where I am in the process. I can jump back up if we have to back up, but it makes it much easier for that performance to turn out well. So the
Hey,
checklist for this is a little bit longer, but
quick
it,
question, Greg.
yeah,
Mark asked in the chat, he says, when you say text callouts, are you talking about the styles and blocks, info warnings, that sort of a
yes,
thing?
yeah, yes, exactly. So these are in screen steps. You can take a paragraph and mark it as a warning or an alert or a tip. Like I said, use them sparingly. But what I do is, and we'll get to this in a second when you're testing, if you see people are skipping an area, then I will call those out. All right. So here's the checklist here. Make sure the text is concise. Use as few words as possible. No video longer than 5 seconds, which basically means no video. Now, why? Well, if you're making something that's scannable, think about if they're having to use this. I once was working with a bank where they wanted to do video for every single procedure they had. I said, what are they supposed to do when they're on the call with someone? Are they going to say, put somebody on hold while I watch this 10-minute video on what to do? That doesn't work. So maybe if it's a quick snippet of showing something, but don't rely on video if you're trying to make this scannable. The language needs to be actionable. Do this, do that, do the, click here, tell them this, be very directive with it. Make sure no foundational knowledge is included. So foundational is all the why we do this, the background that, I mean, when we're working with client documentation, trying to optimize it, that's one of the first things that we're doing is pulling out all of that foundational knowledge. And when you pull that out, it's so much clearer. Once again, Clarify AI is a great tool, in ScreenSteps for doing that. And then with the formatting tools, the ScreenSteps annotations, checklists, bulleted lists, numbered lists, collapsible sections we didn't talk about. Those can be handy to use, so you can have like a heading that expands out more content underneath it, highlights, and then I haven't shown this, but there's a great feature in ScreenSteps called inline links where you can pop up to a whole separate article. So instead of just kind of referencing something, you can have the link to it. And when they click on it, it will bring up that article on top of where they're at. That can be a great tool if maybe this is optional content that they need to go through, then they can pop that up. All right, so if we think we've got something that's findable, followable, scannable, it really isn't that until we test. So we need to test, test, test. And the way you test this is you have somebody who's going to have to use it. And the tough thing here is you've got to keep your mouth shut. So when we'll see this all the time, somebody shows them a guide and they see somebody getting stuck or struggling and they start explaining to them what to do. Well, that defeats the purpose. They're not going to be able to handle this on their own. So you've got to just watch them go. And when they are getting stuck, if it's part of they don't really know how to follow a guide, have them practice. But if you see, oh, that wasn't clear, update the guide, note where they got stuck, update it, and have them try again. And you're working in concert with them to find a solution that they're going to be able to follow on their own. But if you're having to sit there and say, "Oh, no, no, I didn't mean that here. You really need to do this," you're you're falling right back into tribal knowledge, and so you won't get to that place where people are independent. All right, so I'm gonna take the next 7 minutes we've got here for questions. But if you want to delve more into this, we have a free find and follow course that you can. It's a 30-minute course that goes through all the final knowledge stuff. You can also pick up the book Find and Follow. But I'm interested to hear what are people's questions and how it can help. So if you're making a walkthrough and need to be able to start on a certain step, um, so I would argue in most cases, uh, that should be a new walkthrough. So one thing that we talk about is if you're familiar with what swim lanes are, sometimes you'll have procedures that will cross swim lanes. So they like, for example, Thomas needs to do the first 3 steps here, and then I need to take steps 4 through 10, and then John needs to take steps, 11 and on. We would split those up into separate guides because we those aren't matching inputs. The input I receive is not that like the organization needs to do this whole thing. It's that I need to do this job. And so the guide should start where I start. Now, sometimes you'll have a situation, and you can combine those into a larger guide that you can use for review using those inline links. But other times you'll have it's a sort of thing where you're saying, okay, has this already been done? If so, you can start on step 10. That is a great place for decision trees. So when I structure it, I'll say, has this already been done? No. Okay, then do this. Yes, it's going to take me right to where I need to go. So it's still starting there. Now in ScreenSteps, you can link to specific items in a checklist. You can't do it in a decision tree yet. But I think if you're really think of if you're having to start someone halfway through, you're probably not matching the input they're receiving there. I could be wrong, but I would look at that lens first. Okay, how do you look at creating consistent looking articles to improve scannability? Um, Really, if you follow these principles, ScreenSteps doesn't give you a lot of formatting options, and that's intentional because if people are writing stuff, they'll be consistent, especially if they're following the that standard of really being concise with their language. You can set up templates in ScreenSteps, so you can set those up so people have examples to work from. But if they're following these principles, you should end up with articles that are fairly consistent. I'm also so this is me. It may you may not resonate with you, but when I hear people come to me and the very first thing they're saying is we want to make sure the formatting is consistent. I kind of feel like you're missing the point, right? The very first thing is can people use it? And it's usually not consistent formatting that's getting in the way. It's stuff that is not followable that is getting in the way of that. So I would solve that problem first and then worry about the formatting. But I've seen teams that they spend all their time trying to make sure everybody's using the same format and they still have documentation that's not followable there. Um, Next question here. Our agents often have to explain policies or educate customers about policies or procedures in our business, which doesn't really require click-through action on the part of the agent. Any advice on creating articles that provide talking points or explanation agents can use during a call? Yeah, so I would use, in ScreenSteps, they have that feature where you can format text as a call out. And people are like, oh, I don't want my people to sound scripted. I would give them exactly what you want them to say and then let them practice saying it in a natural way. But when you have those scripts, we've seen this. We've looked at call recordings of people who don't have the scripts, they try to explain it in their own words, and they really just confuse the subject most of the time. Like they're stumbling over it, they're leaving things out. Give it to them not in the way you would write it, but in the way they should say it and put that in there. And then if you have to reuse those policies across maybe multiple kind of call types, make those their own articles and use inline links to pop them up where they should say those. So if I need to explain this policy, this is exactly what I should say and bring that up. And another trick you can do there is if maybe there's like the kind of high level of the policy they need to explain, but then somebody may have kind of follow-up questions, include those as collapsible sections underneath. Like if they need more detail about this aspect of the policy, expand that out. We're really just kind of putting that information right at their fingertips to handle that.
Greg, when you're testing your articles, who should you pull in to do that? Should it be new employees, tenured employees, people who have no exposure, some who have done it before, a mix?
I want to have someone who has at least enough foundational knowledge that they could understand the guide without having to learn that foundational knowledge. So I don't necessarily want a brand new employee. I want someone who's less experienced, though. I don't want someone who's an expert to come in. Ideally, I mean, you're going to use who you've got, right? But in the ideal world, I've got someone who's a little bit experienced, but not an expert. Because a mistake you can make is like, okay, well, I want this guide that anybody could follow. If you're really going to make it followable, they need to have a certain level of foundational knowledge. So if I'm dealing with digital banking, I need to know what our digital banking system is. I need to know what digital banking is. I need to know what direct deposit is. Those are things that I should know before I pick up the recipe. So I want to have that baseline knowledge to really test to see if that guide's effective.
Yeah. Because as soon as you start to try to teach that foundational knowledge within the article, you've lost the plot a bit.
Well, and if you get the expert person in, a lot of times they'll go through and they'll go, yeah, 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 okay, yeah, this is good. And they're not doing it. So that's a big thing too, is you don't want people, sometimes people will send out an article for review and they'll say, tell me what you think. That doesn't really tell you anything. You've got to test it with someone who has to follow it. So I like to send it to someone, and if the result that if they're able to follow it without any mistakes, it worked. If we made mistakes or if I had to jump in to add clarification, then we need to improve the guide. Now, sorry, I went through these questions. I didn't ask if I answered if that matched with what you're looking for as far as the creating the consistent look and feel for scannability. All right. Well, we're up at the half hour here. Like I said, I am happy to answer any questions. But we realize this is really a different way than we've ever been taught to write or the examples we've seen, when we're creating documentation. But when you do this, it really transforms things. So keep using that kind of criteria. Is this article findable, followable, scannable? And you'll see great results as you're doing that. So let me know if you have any other questions, but if you need to drop, thanks and have a great weekend.